For 24 years, I was the quiet shadow in the Vance family home. The one who cleaned the spills, folded the linen, and smiled through the polite, devastating insults. They saw me as a simple woman of no consequence, a convenient presence to be used and ignored. But behind my tired eyes lay a truth they never bothered to uncover, a quiet legacy of my own that I kept tucked away while they slowly drowned in their own arrogance. When the foundation of their pride finally began to fracture, I didn't scream or beg for respect. I simply bought the one thing they valued more than my dignity. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, please subscribe, like, and comment. I need to know what happened to follow Eleanor's journey. How far can a mother be pushed before the silence she kept becomes the very trap that closes in on those who took her for granted? The grease on the copper roasting pan never quite came off with normal dish soap. To get it truly clean, I had to use a coarse gray powder that smelled of industrial lime, scrubbing until the skin on my knuckles turned thin and red. "Make sure you get into the rivets, Eleanor," Beatrice said from the kitchen doorway. She didn't step inside. She never did when I was working. She stood on the threshold holding a cup of Earl Grey tea in a blue willow porcelain cup, the set her grandmother had allegedly brought over from England, though I had seen the Made in Japan stamp on the underside of the saucer when I washed it 10 years ago. Marcus's father always said a clean kitchen is the sign of a disciplined home. I'd hate for the house to look neglected when the guests arrive. "Of course, Beatrice," I said, keeping my voice level. My back was stiff from 3 hours of standing over the prep table, dicing root vegetables and trimming the fat from a prime rib roast that had cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "And the silver," she added, her voice carrying that soft, airy cadence that made every demand sound like a favor she was doing for me. "It's looking a bit dull. Clarissa is bringing her in-laws tonight. We must show them we still maintain certain standards, even if times have changed." She turned away, the soft click of her low-heeled slippers fading down the hallway toward the sunroom. I looked down at the copper pan. My reflection in the metal was distorted, my face long and gray under the harsh fluorescent ballast. I was 56, but in this house, under the weight of the Vance family name, I felt 80. Marcus, my husband, came in through the back door a few minutes later. He smelled of cold air and the expensive cedarwood cologne he only wore when his sister Clarissa was coming over. He didn't look at me as he set his leather briefcase on the freshly polished oak table. "Is the roast in?" he asked, reaching into the refrigerator for a club soda. "It's going in now," I said. I wiped my hands on my apron. "Marcus, your mother asked me to polish the silver again. I still have to finish the cobbler and set the table. Could you perhaps ask Julian to help with the chairs?" Marcus paused, the club soda halfway to his mouth. He gave a small, sighing laugh, the kind he used when he wanted to signal that I was being unreasonable without actually having to argue. "Eleanor, Julian's been working 50 hours a week at the firm. He's exhausted. He came here to relax, not to do manual labor. Just do what you can. My mother's 80. She shouldn't have to worry about the presentation." "I wasn't asking your mother to do it," I said quietly. "I was asking Julian." "Same difference," Marcus muttered, already turning toward the living room where the television was murmuring with the afternoon financial news. "Just get it done, Ellie. You know how she gets when things aren't right." He left the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind him. I stood there for a moment, the heavy silence of the kitchen settling over me like dust. I had been Ellie when we first met, a girl from a small farming town 3 hours north, working as a junior clerk at a local insurance office. He had been a Vance, the son of a prominent construction developer whose name was on 3 different municipal buildings in the county. In the beginning, I thought their coldness was just formality. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I anticipated every need, washed every dish, and kept my mouth shut during their long, quiet dinners where they spoke in code about people I didn't know, I would eventually earn my place. It took 20 years to realize that the vacancy I was trying to fill didn't exist. To them, I was a functional asset. I was the person who kept the machinery running so they could pretend the grease didn't exist. At 6 o'clock, the front doorbell rang. Clarissa's voice, high and sharp, drifted down the hall, followed by the deeper, booming laughter of her husband, Richard. I stood by the stove, browning the pearl onions. "Oh, Eleanor," Clarissa said, breezing into the kitchen to drop her heavy wool coat onto the chair I had just wiped down. "You're a lifesaver. The traffic on the bridge was absolute hell. Is there any of that white wine left from Sunday? Richard needs a glass before he has to listen to Mother talk about her garden again." "It's in the door of the fridge, Clarissa," I said. She didn't thank me. She was already reaching for the wine glasses I had polished earlier. She looked at the counter, where a few stray celery leaves lay near the sink. A tiny, almost imperceptible pucker formed between her brows. "Still haven't gotten around to the counters, I see," she said, her tone light, almost teasing. "Well, I suppose we can't all be domestic queens. Just make sure the roast isn't too pink this time. Richard's father has a delicate stomach." She poured her wine and swept out, leaving the coat on my clean chair. I didn't move. I looked at the dark green wool of her coat, the expensive designer label stitched inside the collar. Clarissa hadn't worked a day in her life, yet she spoke to me with the casual authority of a foreman supervising a temporary laborer. Dinner was served on the blue willow plates. I sat at the far end of the table, nearest to the kitchen door, so I could stand up easily to clear the plates between courses. "Julian," Beatrice said, her eyes shining as she looked at my son, who sat next to his father. "Marcus tells me your firm is handling the new commercial development downtown. That must be very exciting for a young man." Julian smiled, a gesture that looked remarkably like his father's, tight, guarded, but pleased. "It's a big project, Grandma. We're restructuring the debt options for the primary investors. It's complicated, but the returns should be substantial." "Of course they will be," Clarissa chimed in, leaning forward. "You have the Vance head for numbers, not like some people who can barely balance a checkbook." A small, heavy silence fell over the table. Marcus took a long sip of his wine. Julian looked down at his plate, his fork tracing the blue pattern on the porcelain. He didn't look at me. He knew, as well as everyone else at the table, that my father had been a small-town accountant who died leaving nothing but a small, unassuming house and a box of old ledger books. They assumed I had inherited his lack of ambition. "Well," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into that soft, dangerous register. "Let's hope Julian uses that head to help his own family. The upkeep on this place is getting ridiculous. The city raised the property taxes again." Marcus cleared his throat, his face reddening slightly. "We'll handle it, Mother. Don't worry about the house." I looked at Beatrice, then at Marcus. There was a subtle tension in the way Marcus held his shoulders, a slight tightness around his mouth that had been there for months. He hadn't mentioned the property taxes to me. He hadn't mentioned money at all, even though he had recently suggested we delay replacing my 10-year-old sedan because the market was volatile. After dinner, while they drank their coffee in the living room, I stood at the sink, washing the blue willow plates by hand. The warm water felt good on my aching fingers, but the skin was starting to crack near the nails. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool, heavy circle of my father's old silver pocket watch. I carried it every Sunday. It was a habit I couldn't break. When the last dish was dried and put away, I walked out to the hallway to retrieve my purse. The door to Marcus's old study was cracked open. He and Beatrice were inside, their voices low and urgent. "The bank sent another notice, Marcus," Beatrice was saying, her voice thin and cracked, stripped of its aristocratic polish. "They're talking about restructuring the primary loan. I don't understand these terms. Your father always took care of the paper." "I know, Mother," Marcus said, his voice strained. "But the firm's cash flow is tight right now. I can't just pull $50,000 out of thin air to cover the arrears. We might have to look into a secondary lien." "No," Beatrice said sharply. "No one in this town can know we are struggling. What would Clarissa's in-laws say? What would people think? You have to find another way." I stood in the dim hallway, my hand resting on the strap of my purse. They didn't know that 3 years ago, when my father passed, the box of ledger books he left behind wasn't filled with old tax returns. They were the records of a private investment partnership he had quietly managed for 40 years from a desk in his basement, a fund that had quietly grown into 7 figures, now managed entirely by a trust under my name. I looked at the closed door, hearing Marcus's heavy, frustrated sigh. I walked out of the house into the cold night air, the heavy front door clicking shut behind me. Monday morning always began with the hum of the washing machine. It was a low, shuddering vibration that traveled up through the floorboards of our kitchen, a constant reminder of the tasks that waited for me. Marcus had left for the office at 7, leaving his coffee mug in the sink with a thin, dark ring dried at the bottom. Beside it lay a receipt from a high-end menswear boutique downtown. $340 for 2 Italian cotton shirts. Just 3 days ago, when I asked him about calling a plumber to look at the slow drain in our master bathroom, he had frowned and told me we needed to watch our auxiliary spending. "The market is tight, Eleanor," he had said, not looking up from his tablet. "We can't be throwing money at things we can handle ourselves." So, I had spent my Saturday afternoon on my knees, clearing hair and gray soap scum from the U-bend with a wire hanger, while he played 18 holes with Richard at the country club. I folded his shirts, the old ones, the ones whose collars were starting to fray slightly at the tips, and stacked them neatly in his dresser. As I did, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Arthur Sterling. "The prospectus is ready, Eleanor. Whenever you have a free hour." Arthur had been my father's attorney and closest friend for 30 years. He was a dry, meticulous man who wore 3-piece suits even in the dead of summer, and he was the only person in the world who knew the true value of the portfolio my father had left behind. When the Vance family spoke of my father as a simple local bookkeeper, they had no idea that his client list had included some of the quietest timber and real estate families in the Pacific Northwest. An hour later, I was sitting in Arthur's quiet, wood-paneled office on the 4th floor of the old bank building downtown. The air smelled of old paper and peppermint lozenges. Arthur slid a thick manila folder across the desk. "The regional bank holding the primary mortgage on the Vance estate is looking to offload several of their residential debt portfolios before the end of the fiscal quarter. They're bundling them into private placements to clear their books." I opened the folder. The numbers were laid out in clean, black columns. Beatrice's home, the grand brick colonial on the hill that had been in the Vance family for 3 generations, was currently securing a first mortgage of $480,000, alongside a secondary home equity line of credit that was nearly maxed out. "They are 3 months behind on the primary," Arthur said softly, resting his fingers together. "The bank has already issued the pre-foreclosure warnings. Marcus has tried to negotiate an extension, but his firm's credit rating is currently under review due to a stalled municipal project. The bank isn't budging." "And if someone were to purchase the debt bundle?" I asked. My voice sounded remarkably steady, even to my own ears. "The purchaser would step into the shoes of the bank," Arthur explained. "You would hold the note. You would have the right to demand immediate payment under the default terms or, should you choose, restructure the terms entirely. Legally, you would own their home's future. I ran my index finger over the signature line on Beatrice's original loan document. It was signed in her elegant, looping cursive from 15 years ago, back when her husband was still alive and the Vance name still carried weight in the local papers. "Prepare the acquisition, Arthur," I said quietly. Arthur looked at me over his reading glasses. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something old and protective in his eyes. "It will require a significant portion of your liquid reserves, Eleanor. It's a concentrated position." "I know," I said, "but my father always told me that the best investments are the ones where you understand the collateral perfectly. I know this house. I know every leak in the roof, every crack in the foundation. I've cleaned them all." On my way back, my phone rang through the car's dashboard speaker. It was Julian. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice brisk. I could hear the clacking of a keyboard in the background. "Did Dad leave his brown leather loafers at Grandma's yesterday? I've got a dinner with the senior partners tomorrow night, and those are the only shoes that go with my gray suit." "Hello, Julian," I said. "How was your morning?" A brief pause on the line, a small pocket of air where his irritation hovered. "It was busy, Mom. Standard Monday. Did you see the shoes or not?" "I didn't look, Julian. I was busy this morning." "Well, can you check?" he asked, his tone dropping into that familiar, impatient register he had inherited from his father. "Grandma's house is on your way back from grocery shopping anyway, right? Just run in and grab them. And if they're dusty, could you give him a quick wipe? I really don't have time to do it before the dinner." We don't just teach people how to treat us. Sometimes our silence teaches our children that we don't have feelings of our own. I had spent 28 years shielding Julian from the coldness of his father's family, only to watch him slowly adopt their language. "I'll see if I can find them," I said. I parked in the gravel driveway of Beatrice's estate 20 minutes later. The gravel crunching under my tires felt unusually loud in the quiet afternoon. I used my key to open the heavy back door, entering through the mudroom where the scent of lemon polish and old wool always lingered. I walked quietly toward the den, where Marcus's old shoes were usually kept in the closet. As I approached the dining room, I heard the clink of porcelain. "It's a good thing Eleanor doesn't mind doing the heavy lifting." Clarissa's voice drifted through the high archway, casual and light. "I don't know what we'd do if Marcus had married someone with expectations. We'd have to hire a real housekeeper, and frankly, with the mortgage what it is right now, that's the last thing we need." I stopped, my hand hovering over the brass doorknob of the den. "Well," Beatrice replied, her voice smooth and untroubled, "she has no social circle to maintain anyway. It gives her a purpose. Without this family, she'd just be another lonely woman sitting in a small house. She should be grateful Marcus kept her stable." I stood in the dim hallway, the polished leather of Julian's shoes heavy in my hands. I looked down at them, then at the chipped blue willow tea set sitting on the display shelf in the hallway. I didn't make a sound. I quietly turned around, walked out the back door, and left the shoes on the porch. "You left them on the porch, Mom." Julian's voice was tight with irritation over the phone the next morning. "It rained for 20 minutes yesterday afternoon. The leather has water spots now." I sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of black coffee cooling in front of me. "I had to leave quickly, Julian. I left them where you could find them." "Well, you could have just unlocked the door and put them inside," he grumbled. "Grandma was right there. It's not like she wouldn't have let you in. Now I have to see if the dry cleaner can buff them out before tonight. It's just really inconvenient." "I'm sorry you were inconvenienced," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the frantic apologies I would have offered a year ago. Julian paused, perhaps sensing the lack of weight in my response, but he quickly dismissed it. "Whatever, I'll just handle it. But please, next time, just think a little." He hung up without saying goodbye. That evening, Marcus didn't mention the shoes. Instead, he waited until we were sitting in the living room, the television playing a rerun of some sitcom he didn't really watch. "My mother called me today, Ellie," he said, keeping his eyes on the screen. "She said you came by yesterday, left Julian's shoes on the wet boards, and drove off without even coming in to say hello. She thought it was very strange. Very rude, actually." "I was tired, Marcus," I said, folding a basket of his socks. "Tired from what?" He finally turned his head, his brow furrowed in that patronizing way he used whenever I expressed fatigue. "You don't work 40 hours a week, Eleanor. You're home most of the day. My mother is 80 years old. She deserves a little respect when you visit her property." Her property. He always referred to Beatrice's house as if it were a sacred museum, a monument to their family's superior status, rather than a crumbling brick draft house that was currently drowning in unpaid interest. "I do respect your mother," I said softly, tucking one sock into another. "I respect her exactly as much as she respects me." Marcus let out a short, scoffing breath. "What is that supposed to mean? Honestly, Ellie, you've been so sensitive lately. Distracted, too. I'm starting to wonder if your memory is doing okay. Maybe we should have Dr. Henderson run some tests. Women your age, well, things start to slip." There it was, the gentle, manipulative concern. If I was unhappy, it wasn't because of how they treated me. It was because my mind was failing. It was a convenient diagnostic tool they used to dismiss any crack in my compliance. "I'm fine, Marcus," I said. "My memory has never been sharper." On Thursday afternoon, the phone rang at 4:30. "Ellie," Marcus said, his voice hurried. "Clarissa and Richard are dropping Mother off at our place in an hour. They need to discuss the arrangements for the country club charity gala, and our dining room has better lighting for the floor plans. Just whip up some pasta or something. Nothing fancy, just quick." A year ago, those words would have sent me into a panic. I would have abandoned whatever I was doing, rushed to the supermarket, spent $80 of my own housekeeping money on fresh herbs, high-end cheeses, and a decent bottle of Pinot Grigio, and sweated over the stove for an hour to ensure they had a gourmet meal. This time, I didn't leave the house. I went to the pantry. I found a box of generic, dried spaghetti that had been sitting on the shelf for 6 months. I found a jar of store-brand marinara sauce. I boiled the pasta, dumped the cold sauce over it, and set the table with our everyday stoneware plates, the ones with the small chips on the edges that I had bought at a garage sale when we were first married. When they arrived, the house didn't smell like garlic and roasted meat. It smelled like nothing. Beatrice walked into the dining room, her nose wrinkling slightly. She sat down, her posture rigid, and looked at the chipped stoneware plate in front of her. "Oh," she said, her voice dropping into that airy, polite whisper. "Spaghetti. How rustic, Eleanor. I didn't realize we were having a children's meal tonight." "It was what was in the pantry, Beatrice," I said, sitting down and taking a small portion for myself. Clarissa picked up her fork, turning a strand of pasta over as if she were inspecting it for contamination. "Marcus, dear, are things all right with the grocery budget? If you need a little help, Richard has some excellent contacts at the wholesale clubs. You can buy these things in bulk. It saves a lot of money for simpler households." Marcus's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a warning he couldn't speak aloud in front of his mother. "We're fine, Clarissa. Eleanor was just busy today, I'm sure." "I wasn't busy," I said, taking a bite of the pasta. It was bland. I hadn't salted the water. I just didn't see the need to make a fuss. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Richard cleared his throat, shifting his large frame in the dining chair. Beatrice slowly set her fork down, not having touched a single bite. "Well," Beatrice said, looking at Marcus rather than me, "I suppose we should get straight to the floor plans. We don't want to overstay our welcome in such a busy home." They left by 8. They didn't offer to help clear the table, and Clarissa didn't thank me for the meal. Marcus escorted them to their cars, his voice hushed and apologetic as he spoke to his mother on the driveway. When he came back inside, he slammed the front doors so hard the glass in the side light rattled. "What the hell was that, Eleanor?" he hissed, walking into the kitchen where I was loading the dishwasher. "You embarrassed me. You embarrassed us in front of Richard's family. Serving my mother cheap jarred sauce on chipped plates? Are you trying to make it look like we're starving?" "We aren't starving, Marcus," I said, closing the dishwasher door with a soft click. "But we are living within our means. You told me ourselves we had to watch our auxiliary spending. I took your advice." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His chest heaved with a quiet, impotent fury. He couldn't argue with his own logic, but the humiliation of having his family see the reality of our budget was eating him alive. At midnight, after Marcus had gone to sleep, his loud, rhythmic snoring filling our bedroom, I went downstairs to my small sewing room. It was the only room in the house that didn't have his mother's old landscape paintings on the walls. I opened my laptop and logged into my private bank portal. There was a new document waiting in my secure inbox, sent by Arthur's assistant. It was a digital deed of transfer, signed by the vice president of the regional bank. Assignment of mortgage debt, Beatrice Vance Estate. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page. My name, Eleanor Vance, was listed as the sole managing member of EV Holdings LLC. Under the default terms of the original loan, I now held the legal right to foreclose on Beatrice's beloved brick colonial if the outstanding balance of $14,000 in arrears wasn't paid within 15 days. I looked out the window at the dark, quiet street. The Vance family thought I was losing my touch, losing my mind, losing my value. They had no idea I had just bought their pride. Exclusion is rarely a violent act. It is usually packaged as a mercy. People lock you out of a room and tell you they did it so you wouldn't have to feel the draft. On Monday evening, I found the invitation on the console table in our entryway. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold leaf lettering. The annual Pinecrest Charity Gala. It was the social event of the year for families like the Vances, a night where they could dress in tuxedos and silk gowns and pretend their bank accounts were as sturdy as their family trees. The envelope was addressed to Mr. Marcus Vance and guest. In previous years, it had always read Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Vance. I had spent weeks preparing my one good dress, coordinating the drop-offs for Beatrice, and making sure Marcus's studs were polished. "Marcus," I asked that night as he was hanging up his coat, "the invitation for the gala arrived. Why does it say, 'and guest'?" He didn't look at me. He kept his back turned, carefully smoothing the shoulders of his wool coat before placing it on the wooden hanger. "Oh, right. Well, Mother and I were talking about that. Honestly, Ellie, with how stressed you've been lately, and that disastrous dinner last week, we figured you'd find the whole thing incredibly draining. Clarissa's husband, Richard, has some major out-of-town developers coming, and they need an extra seat at their table. We thought it would be best if Clarissa took the second ticket." "I see," I said. My voice was very quiet, almost lost in the hum of the refrigerator. "So you decided for me?" We didn't decide for you, he said, turning around with a look of mild defensive annoyance. We made a practical adjustment to save you the anxiety. You've been so distant, Ellie. Frankly, we didn't think you'd even want to go. You always complain about how much your feet hurt afterward anyway. This way, you get a quiet night to yourself. And what will you tell people when they ask where your wife is? Marcus shrugged, reaching into his pocket for his car keys. We'll just tell them you weren't feeling up to it. People understand. At our age, health has to come first. He walked past me into the living room, leaving the cream-colored card on the table. He had already moved past the decision. In his mind, he had done me a favor. He had erased me from the guest list and reframed it as an act of spousal care. The next day, I drove downtown to see Arthur. The autumn wind was picking up, sending dry brown oak leaves scraping across the pavement as I walked into his office. Arthur was waiting with a fresh pot of coffee and a thin ledger. The certified letter was delivered to Beatrice's post office box this morning, Eleanor, Arthur said, pouring me a cup. Under the terms of the assignment, they have precisely 12 days left to cure the default of $14,682. If they fail to do so, we are legally entitled to initiate foreclosure proceedings on the property. Have they tried to contact the bank? I asked. Marcus called the loan officer this morning, demanding to know who purchased the debt, Arthur said, a dry, faint smile touching his lips. The bank, of course, referred him to us. He spoke to my secretary an hour ago, quite frantic, asking for a meeting with the managing director of EV Holdings. He has no idea the LLC belongs to you. Don't give him the meeting yet, Arthur, I said, holding the warm mug between my hands. Let him worry for a few days. Let him search for the money. He won't find it easily, Arthur noted. Marcus's personal credit is fully extended. He took out a bridge loan 6 months ago to cover his portion of Julian's law school debt and some of his mother's medical expenses. He is living on a knife edge. I looked out the window at the gray sky. He didn't tell me about the bridge loan. He wouldn't, Arthur said softly. To admit to financial struggle would be to admit to a flaw in the Vance armor. They would rather drown in their own silence than ask for help from someone they deem beneath them. On Sunday, we drove to Beatrice's house for the weekly family gathering. As we walked up the steps, Marcus turned to me. Don't worry about the kitchen today, Ellie. Clarissa ordered French bistro platters from that new place downtown. We figured we'd give you a complete day off. It sounded kind. It sounded like a reprieve. But when we walked inside, the reality of my day off became clear within minutes. The food arrived in large, greasy aluminum trays, delivered by a young man who left them on the dining room sideboard. Oh, thank goodness it's here, Clarissa said, coming down the stairs in a silk blouse. Eleanor, could you grab some serving spoons from the drawer? And we'll need the good plates. The catering company didn't bring servingware. I stood in the kitchen doorway. I thought I had the day off, Clarissa. Clarissa laughed, a high, musical sound that had no warmth in it. Well, yes, from the cooking, silly. But we still have to eat like civilized people. It's just setting the table. Surely you don't mind doing that much. Julian was sitting at the dining table, typing on his phone. He looked up, his expression entirely neutral. Yeah, Mom, just grab the plates. I'm starving. I looked at my son. He was 28. He had my father's green eyes, but the rest of him, the slouch, the easy entitlement, the casual way he expected his environment to be ordered around him without effort, belonged entirely to the Vances. I got the plates. I set the table. I served the food. During the meal, the conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They talked about Richard's golf handicap, about Clarissa's upcoming trip to Arizona, and about Julian's new clients. "We're booking the flights for the Cabo trip on Tuesday," Julian said, taking a bite of a rosemary potato. "Dad, you need to send me your passport number. Richard says the resort fills up fast this time of year." I paused, my fork hovering over my plate. "Cabo?" I asked. Julian looked at me, a brief flash of discomfort crossing his face before he smoothed it over. "Oh, yeah, just a guy's golf trip. Me, Dad, Richard, and his brothers. We're going for a week in November." "I see," I said. "You didn't mention it, Marcus." Marcus didn't look up from his chicken. "It was a last-minute thing, Ellie. Richard's firm is sponsoring the tournament. Besides, we knew you wouldn't want to go. You hate the heat, and someone needs to stay back and check on Mother while we're away. Her knees have been acting up with the damp weather." No one had asked. No one had checked to see if I wanted to go, or if I had plans of my own. They had simply carved out my role, the caretaker who stayed behind in the cold while they flew south into the sun. "Of course," I said quietly. "Someone has to watch the house." That night, back at our place, Marcus was sitting at the dining room table, sorting through a stack of Beatrice's mail that he had brought home to review. Suddenly, he stopped. I was standing in the kitchen, wiping down the stovetop, watching him through the glass of the microwave door. I saw him reach for a heavy, certified white envelope. He slid his thumb under the flap, pulling out a single sheet of paper. Even from 10 feet away, I could see his shoulders go rigid. He stared at the paper for a long, silent minute, his breath catching in his throat. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed. "Clarissa," he whispered, his voice cracking with a fear I had never heard in him before. "We have a problem. The bank sold Mother's mortgage. Some company called EV Holdings. They're demanding immediate payment of the entire arrears. We have 12 days, Clarissa. 12 days. Or they're taking the house." I kept wiping the stove, the cloth moving in smooth, quiet circles. Men like Marcus do not hide their troubles from their wives to protect them. They hide them to protect their own illusion of superiority. To admit failure to the person you have spent decades looking down upon is to destroy the only hierarchy you have left. On Tuesday morning, Marcus's hands shook so badly he dropped his car keys twice in the hallway. I stood by the coat rack, watching him bend down to retrieve them, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, and saw me looking. "Is everything all right, Marcus?" I asked, my voice as smooth and neutral as a calm lake. "You look like you didn't sleep." He let out a sharp, defensive laugh, straightening his tie with jerky movements. "Of course I'm fine. Just a hitch with the municipal project. Logistics, Eleanor. Nothing you'd understand. Don't worry your head about it." "If it's a financial issue, we could always look at our savings," I suggested, knowing exactly how little was left in our joint account after his recent investments with Richard. Marcus scoffed, grabbing his briefcase. "Our savings? Ellie, the kind of numbers I deal with aren't solved by whatever is left in our household ledger. Just focus on keeping the house clean. I have to go." He slammed the door behind him. He didn't realize that the simple bookkeeper's daughter he was dismissing had spent her morning reviewing the cash flow statements of his construction firm and noting that his company's primary line of credit had just been frozen. By Thursday, the emotional distance in the house had become a physical wall. Marcus barely spoke. He took his phone calls in the garage, his voice a low, frantic murmur that drifted up through the floor vents in the kitchen. On Saturday afternoon, He stood by the kitchen island, not looking at me as he poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Ellie, don't worry about Sunday dinner tomorrow. Mother's had a rough week with her blood pressure. Clarissa thinks she needs absolute quiet. I'm just going to pop over there for an hour to check on her and help her with some administrative things. But you should stay here and rest." "I could bring her some of my chicken broth," I said. "It always helps her when she's feeling frail." "No," Marcus said, his voice snapping with a sudden sharp edge. "No broth, Eleanor. She doesn't need visitors. Just stay home." I nodded, pretending to be placated. "All right, if you think it's best." But on Sunday afternoon, after Marcus had left, I got into my car. I drove to Beatrice's estate, parking on the side street 2 blocks away, where the high privacy hedges obscured my vehicle. I walked up the gravel driveway quietly, my soft-soled shoes making no sound against the stones. The heavy drapes in the dining room were drawn, but the sheer inner curtains allowed me to see inside. They were all there. Marcus, Clarissa, Richard, and Julian were huddled around the mahogany table. Papers were scattered everywhere: tax documents, bank statements, and the blue certified envelope from EV Holdings. Beatrice sat at the head of the table, her face pale and sunken, holding a lace handkerchief to her eyes. Richard was pacing the length of the room, his face flushed and angry, gesturing wildly with his hands. Julian sat next to his father, his laptop open, his brow furrowed as he pointed at the screen. They were a family in crisis, united in their terror, desperately trying to find a way to save the brick fortress of their pride. And they had excluded me entirely, believing that I was too simple, too useless, to be of any help in a real storm. I stood in the cold shadow of the rhododendron bushes, holding the warm glass jar of chicken broth I had brought anyway. I watched them panic. I watched my husband wipe sweat from his forehead. I watched my son shake his head in defeat. I didn't knock on the door. I walked back down the driveway, placed the jar of broth quietly on the back porch railing, and drove home. Later that evening, Julian stopped by our house to retrieve some tax files Marcus had kept in our home office. Marcus was still in the garage, pacing the concrete floor with his phone pressed to his ear. Julian looked exhausted. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He grabbed the folder from the entryway table and turned to leave. "Julian," I said, stepping out of the kitchen, "you look tired. Are you eating enough? I left some soup on your grandmother's porch today." Julian stopped. He turned to me, his chest heaving with a sudden, volatile frustration. "Mom, seriously? Soup? We have actual, real-world problems to deal with right now. You have absolutely no idea what is going on, and quite frankly, your little domestic check-ins are just incredibly annoying." The words cut, but they didn't bleed. They only solidified the cold space inside my chest. "I was only caring for you, Julian," I said quietly. "Well, don't," he snapped, his voice dripping with the classic Vance disdain. "Some of us are trying to save this family from losing everything, while you're worrying about broth and clean floors. Just stay out of it, okay? You can't help us with this." He walked out, slamming the door. My own son, whom I had carried and protected, looking at me as if I were a mild cognitive burden, completely unaware that I held the keys to his entire comfortable life in my desk drawer. On Monday morning, Arthur Sterling called me. "Marcus made an offer, Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice dry and professional over the speakerphone. "He managed to scrape together $4,200, most likely a cash advance from his personal credit card. He offered it to EV Holdings in exchange for a 90-day grace period on the remaining balance." And what did you tell him, Arthur? I told him that the managing member of EV Holdings has flatly rejected the proposal. I informed him that we require the full balance of $14,682 in certified funds by Friday at 5 o'clock. If the funds are not received, we will file the foreclosure paperwork on Monday morning. Did he say anything else? He begged, Eleanor, Arthur said softly. He asked if he could speak to the owner directly. He said his mother is 80 years old and a foreclosure would kill her. I looked at my reflection in the window. There will be no extensions, Arthur. 9 days left. I hung up. Through the kitchen window, I could see Marcus sitting in his car in the driveway, his forehead resting against the steering wheel, completely broken. I felt nothing but a quiet, chilling calm. When people are losing their grip on their social status, they cling to the rituals of that status even harder. The tuxedo is a shroud, but to a man like Marcus, it was still a shield. On Friday evening, the night of the Pinecrest Charity Gala, the house was filled with the sharp, chemical scent of his hair gel and the heavy musk of his expensive cologne. I sat in the armchair in our darkened living room, a book open on my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in an hour. Marcus came down the stairs, his tuxedo fitting a bit looser than it had the year before. He looked terrible. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness, and his hands trembled so badly he couldn't get his silver cufflinks through the starched holes of his French cuffs. He didn't ask me for help. He stood by the mirror in the hallway, cursing softly under his breath as he struggled with the metal. From the driveway, a car horn sounded. Clarissa was waiting in her luxury SUV. Marcus looked at me, sitting in the shadow of the living room. "I'm leaving, Eleanor," he said, his voice stiff. "Don't wait up. It's going to be a long night. Richard has several key investors to introduce me to. This night is critical." "I'm sure it is," I said quietly. "Have a wonderful time, Marcus." He didn't reply. He grabbed his wool overcoat, threw it over his arm, and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the quiet, empty house. I waited 20 minutes. Then, I stood up. I didn't stay home to nurse my wounds. I went to our bedroom closet and pulled out a simple, elegant black silk dress, one I had purchased with my own inheritance money months ago, without Marcus's knowledge. I styled my hair, applied a subtle red lipstick, and put on a coat. I didn't drive to the gala as a guest. The Pinecrest Country Club had a high-end public restaurant attached to the main building, separated from the private ballroom by a grand glass partition. Anyone could book a table there, provided they could afford the menu. At 8:30, I was sitting at a corner table in the dim, mahogany-paneled dining room, a glass of dry white wine in front of me. Arthur Sterling joined me 10 minutes later, looking impeccably sharp in his own charcoal suit. He sat down, giving me a respectful nod. "You look beautiful, Eleanor," he said softly. "Thank you, Arthur," I replied, looking through the glass partition at the glittering ballroom beyond. The gala was in full swing. Hundreds of local elites were circulating under the crystal chandeliers. Near the grand bar, I spotted the Vance family. They were putting on a brave face, but the cracks were visible to anyone who knew where to look. Beatrice sat in a velvet armchair, her posture stiff, her head held high, but she was clutching her designer purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Clarissa was laughing too loudly, her gestures overly animated as she spoke to a group of women who looked mildly amused. And Marcus. My husband looked like a ghost, haunting his own life. He stood on the periphery of Richard's circle, holding a glass of scotch that he kept swirling but rarely drank. When Richard introduced his wealthy clients, Marcus would step forward, his smile desperate and pleading. But I could see the subtle body language of the other men, the way they leaned away from him, the polite, brief handshakes, the quick glances over his shoulder for someone more important. The rumors about Marcus's firm are spreading, Arthur said quietly, following my gaze. Two of his major subcontractors pulled their crews off the municipal site this afternoon due to non-payment. Richard is already trying to distance himself. He told the club board today that he has no financial ties to Marcus's business. And Beatrice's house? I asked, taking a sip of my wine. 6 days left, Eleanor, Arthur said. They have made no progress on the funds. Marcus tried to secure a personal loan from 3 different local banks this week, using his own house as collateral. They all turned him down. His debt-to-income ratio is far too high. I watched Julian walk over to his father. Julian looked sharp, but his expression was marred by a visible irritation. He whispered something to Marcus, gesturing toward the door, and Marcus flinched. My son was embarrassed by his father's desperation. He was already learning to treat his father with the same cold, utilitarian metric the family had always used on me. At 10 o'clock, I stood up to leave. I thanked Arthur, walked out of the restaurant, and entered the grand marble lobby of the country club. The air was cool and smelled of expensive perfume and fresh lilies. As I walked toward the valet, I saw a figure leaning against one of the massive stone pillars near the exit. It was Marcus. His bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his collar, and his tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned. He had a glass of amber liquid in his hand, and his face was flushed. He had drunk too much to dull the panic. He turned his head and saw me. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. For a second, he looked like he had seen a ghost. Then, his shock twisted into a deep, ugly fury. He stumbled toward me, grabbing my upper arm in a tight, desperate grip. He leaned in close, his breath hot and smelling of scotch. "What the hell are you doing here, Eleanor?" he hissed, his voice a harsh, ragged whisper. "Did you follow me? Are you trying to humiliate me? Look at you, sneaking around in a place like this. You don't belong here." He looked around the lobby frantically, terrified that someone would see us together. "Go home," he muttered, shaking my arm slightly. "Go back to the house where you belong. You're making a scene. I have enough to deal with tonight without you playing these stupid games." He was drowning, yet his first instinct was still to push my head underwater to keep himself afloat. He still believed he was the master of this dynamic. I looked down at his hand on my arm. Then, I looked up into his bloodshot eyes. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with a cold, precise clarity that seemed to slice through the ambient noise of the lobby. "Loose your grip, Marcus," I said. He blinked, taken aback by the utter lack of fear in my voice, but his hand remained. "You have 6 days left to find $15,682, I whispered, leaning in just enough so only he could hear. "I suggest you spend your time more wisely than drinking yourself into a stupor in public." Marcus froze. His hand slowly slipped off my arm. His face drained of all color, turning a pasty, sickly gray. "How?" he stammered, his jaw slack, a sudden terrifying confusion dawning in his eyes. "How do you know that number?" I didn't answer. I turned and walked out into the cool night air, leaving him standing alone on the polished marble floor. There is a strange, quiet justice in watching people dismantle their own history piece by piece. They wrap their pride in yesterday's garbage, packing away the symbols of their supposed superiority, all while still believing they are better than the person holding the tape. On Saturday morning, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, a cold cup of black coffee sitting untouched before him. He was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his skin had a gray, papery texture. I was at the stove, preparing a simple pot of oatmeal. The rhythmic scraping of my wooden spoon against the metal pot was the only sound in the room. "Eleanor?" he said, his voice hoarse and raw. "Yes, Marcus?" He swallowed hard, his chest heaving as he struggled to find the words. "About last night, in the lobby of the club, what you said, how did you know that exact number? Have you been going through my desk, spying on my mother's mail?" He was trying to claw back his authority. He wanted to make me the transgressor, to accuse me of some domestic crime so he could feel like the victim instead of the debtor. I turned down the heat on the stove and looked at him. My expression was entirely placid. "I don't need to spy on your desk, Marcus. The walls in this house are very thin, and your panic is very loud." Marcus flinched. He opened his mouth to reply, to demand a better explanation, but the sheer, icy composure in my eyes stopped him. He didn't have the courage to press further. He was too afraid of what the answer might be. Before he could speak, the front doorbell rang. It was a sharp, aggressive sound that made Marcus jump. I went to open it. Beatrice and Clarissa pushed past me without a word. They didn't look at me. They didn't acknowledge my presence at all. They swept into the living room like a pair of high-ranking officers entering a war room. Beatrice was trembling, her expensive wool coat hanging loosely on her frail frame, while Clarissa's face was tight with a frantic, ugly energy. "Marcus," Beatrice gasped, sinking onto our sofa. "Richard says he can't do anything. He talked to his partners and they won't authorize a business loan for a personal estate. The bank's lawyers won't even return my calls. We have 4 days left, Marcus. 4 days." Marcus stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his shoulders slumping. "I know, Mother. I've tried everything. No one is lending right now." Clarissa paced the floor, her heels digging into our rug. "We have to sell the heirlooms. The sterling silver tea service, my grandmother's emerald brooch, the antique flatware. We have to pawn them, or sell them to an estate buyer. It's the only way to get cash by Friday." She turned her head, her sharp eyes finally landing on me as I stood quietly near the hallway. "Eleanor," Clarissa ordered, her voice snapping with a cold, desperate authority. "Don't just stand there staring. Go fetch some old newspapers and bubble wrap from the garage. We need to pack these things up immediately so Richard can take them to the appraiser before the shops close." They didn't ask if they could use our living room as a packing station. They didn't ask if I minded. To them, I was simply the domestic utility required to facilitate their desperate salvation. "Of course, Clarissa," I said softly. I went to the garage. I retrieved the cardboard boxes, the rolls of packing tape, and the stacks of old newsprint I had carefully saved and folded over the years. When I returned, Beatrice had laid out the contents of her velvet-lined mahogany chest on our dining room table. There it was, the sterling silver tea service I had polished every holiday for 24 years. The heavy, ornate forks and spoons that had fed their pride while I cleared their plates. The emerald brooch that Beatrice had worn to every country club dinner to signal her wealth. "Be careful with that, Eleanor," Clarissa hissed as I began wrapping the silver teapot in newsprint. "That teapot was a wedding gift to my grandmother. It's irreplaceable. But I suppose you wouldn't understand the pain of having to sacrifice family heritage. Your family didn't really have heirlooms, did they?" I tucked the gray newsprint around the silver handle. I felt the cold, heavy metal beneath my fingers. I remembered the exact smell of the silver polish, the way the black tarnish would transfer to my skin, staining my cuticles for days. I had nurtured this silver. I had kept it alive. And now, I was wrapping it in cheap paper to be sold off to a stranger for scrap value. "No," I said quietly, tape snapping as I sealed the box. "My family didn't have heirlooms like this. We only had our word. and our debts were always paid. Clarissa let out a sharp, irritated breath, dismissing my comment as she always did. By 4 in the afternoon, Richard returned from the estate appraiser. He walked into our house, throwing his car keys onto the entry table with a heavy, metallic clatter. He looked exhausted and grim. "Well?" Clarissa demanded, rushing to him. "What did they say?" Richard shook his head, refusing to look Beatrice in the eye. "The silver market is flooded. They're only buying for melt value. And the emerald brooch?" He paused, rubbing his temples. "The appraiser says the center stone was replaced with a synthetic green quartz years ago. It's virtually worthless. They offered us $3,000 for the entire lot." Beatrice let out a soft, choked cry, her hand flying to her mouth. Clarissa spun around to Marcus, her eyes wide with horror. "3,000?" Clarissa screamed, her voice cracking. "That's impossible! That brooch was appraised at $10,000 10 years ago." "10 years ago was a different market," Richard muttered, walking into the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water. "And someone obviously swapped the stone. Either way, we're still over $11,000 short. We aren't going to make it, Marcus." Marcus looked like he was going to vomit. He leaned against the wall, his chest heaving, his gaze fixed on the empty floor. I stood in the shadow of the dining room doorway. On the floor beneath the table, a single silver sugar tong had fallen out of the box, overlooked in their panic. I leaned down quietly, picked up the cold silver piece, and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. I looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. 4 days left. I walked into the kitchen, picked up my phone, and dialed Arthur Sterling. "Arthur," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Prepare the foreclosure filing for Monday morning. They don't have the money." When the golden ship starts to sink, the crew doesn't rally to save the captain. They scramble for the lifeboats, pushing each other into the freezing water to save themselves. On Monday morning, the fracturing of the Vance family dynamic became loud. I stood in the kitchen, slicing apples for a tart, while Marcus and Julian argued in our small home office down the hall. Their voices, usually so hushed and controlled, rose to a sharp, ugly pitch that cut through the quiet house. "You want me to do what, Dad?" Julian's voice was incredulous, stripped of all filial respect. "Take out a signature loan? I just started as a junior associate. My credit is under review by the state bar. If my name gets flagged on a high-risk personal loan for a failing family estate, my career is dead before it even starts." "It's your grandmother's house, Julian," Marcus pleaded, his voice thin and desperate. "It's your legacy. The Vance name is on that deed. If we lose it to some faceless holding company, we lose everything." "Then you should have managed your business better," Julian snapped. "Or Grandma should have downsized years ago. I'm not throwing my financial future into a sinking ship. Richard won't even co-sign for you. Why should I?" A heavy, suffocating silence followed. I kept slicing the apples, the blade of my knife making a rhythmic, clean thwack against the cutting board. The illusion of their superior bloodline, of the unbreakable Vance loyalty, was shattering. When the money vanished, the respect vanished with it. Julian didn't see a father to be protected. He saw a liability to be avoided. By noon, Julian had left, slamming our front door so hard the glass rattled. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Clarissa. "Eleanor," she sobbed, her voice high and hysterical. "You have to come to Mother's, right now. She won't eat. She's locked herself in her bedroom and she won't let me in. The kitchen sink is backed up and Richard is screaming at me because he can't find his tax files. I don't know what to do. Please, Eleanor, just come." Even in the middle of a nervous breakdown, Clarissa couldn't bring herself to say, "Please help me," or "Thank you." She demanded my presence as if it were a default setting on a machine she owned. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Clarissa," I said quietly. When I arrived at Beatrice's estate, the physical environment was already beginning to match the rot inside the family. The trash cans at the side of the house had been knocked over by raccoons, spreading rotting food across the gravel driveway. Inside, the grand entry hall smelled of stale coffee and damp carpet. Clarissa was sitting on the stairs, her mascara smeared, her expensive silk blouse stained with coffee. She looked up at me with a mixture of resentment and desperate relief. "She's upstairs," Clarissa whispered, pointing a manicured finger toward the landing. "She won't talk to me. She told me I was useless." I didn't reply. I went to the kitchen, cleared the dirty coffee mugs from the counter, and brewed a fresh pot of chamomile tea. I poured it into an ordinary ceramic mug, not the blue willow set, and walked up the sweeping spiral staircase. I knocked softly on Beatrice's bedroom door. "Beatrice, it's Eleanor. I've brought you some tea." A long pause, then the sound of a key turning in the lock. The door opened an inch. Beatrice looked out at me, her eyes sunken, her silver hair uncombed and wild. When she saw it was me and not Clarissa or Marcus, she opened the door wider and let out a shaky breath. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank goodness. Come in, please." I stepped into the grand bedroom. The silver-framed photographs of her late husband and her children sat on the mahogany dresser, but they were covered in a thin layer of dust. The bed was unmade. The grand matriarch of the Vance family was gone. In her place was a terrified, fragile old woman. She sat on the edge of the unmade bed, her hands trembling as she took the warm mug from me. She clung to my hand, her grip surprisingly tight, her dry, papery skin scraping against mine. "Marcus is so weak, Eleanor," she wept, her tears falling into the steam of the tea. "He just paces and makes excuses. And Richard is so angry. He told Clarissa we should just let the bank take the house and put me in a state-run facility. They want to throw me away, Eleanor. My father built this house. I was married in this garden. If they take this house, I have nothing." The psychological insight was clear to me then. Vulnerability in cruel people is rarely genuine. It is merely a temporary adaptation to fear. Beatrice wasn't apologizing for 24 years of treating me like a servant. She wasn't expressing regret for the quiet humiliations she had inflicted upon me. She was simply trying to use my soft heart as a shield against the cold wind of her own consequences. "I know, Beatrice," I said softly, gently pulling my hand back from her grasp. "It's a very heavy burden." "Can you talk to Marcus?" she begged, looking up at me with watery, desperate eyes. "He listens to you sometimes. Tell him he has to find the money. He has to save me." "I'll do what I can," I lied. I stood up and began tidying the room, folding her discarded cardigans and placing them back in the cedar chest. As I wiped down her bedside table, I noticed the drawer was slightly ajar. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of her late husband's old letters, was a blue legal envelope. The color caught my eye. It was the exact shade of the folders Arthur Sterling used. I waited until Beatrice turned her head to look out the window, and then I quietly slid the folder out of the drawer and tucked it beneath the folded laundry in my basket. An hour later, after I had quieted the house, washed the dishes, and left Beatrice resting, I sat in my car at the end of the driveway. I opened the blue folder. It was a private bridge loan agreement from 5 years ago, securing a personal line of credit for $75,000, signed by Beatrice and guaranteed by Marcus. The collateral was her historic home. But it was the lender's name that made my heart stop. Lender, Sterling Trust Partners, LLC. I stared at the name. Sterling Trust Partners was not a bank. It was a private real estate holding company managed entirely by Arthur Sterling on behalf of my father's private estate. My father had quietly held a secondary lien on Beatrice's home for 5 years. Marcus had been paying interest to my father's trust for half a decade to keep his construction firm afloat, without ever realizing that the money he was borrowing belonged to the family of the simple bookkeeper he so thoroughly despised. And now, as the sole heir of my father's estate, I owned both the primary bank mortgage and the secondary bridge loan. The trap wasn't just closed. It had been built years ago, and they had walked into it entirely on their own. When you spend decades treating a person like a piece of furniture, you forget that furniture has ears. You forget that it occupies space, that it watches, and that eventually it can be moved to block the only exit. On Tuesday evening, the pressure in our home became physical. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of Marcus's sweat and the stale smell of the scotch he had been drinking since 3 in the afternoon. He sat on the edge of our bed, his head bowed, his hands clasped between his knees. He was a man who had never shown me genuine vulnerability, except as a weapon to extract an apology or a service. But now, he was truly unraveled. When I walked into the bedroom with a basket of fresh towels, he looked up, and I saw tears tracking through the gray stubble on his cheeks. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please. I don't know what to do." I set the towels on the dresser, my movements slow and deliberate. "What's wrong, Marcus?" "We're going to lose the house," he sobbed, his shoulders shaking. "The business is done. The bank is going to freeze our personal accounts by next week. If Mother gets evicted, it will kill her. And Clarissa will never speak to me again." He looked at me with a desperate, pleading hope that made my stomach turn. "Your father," he stammered, taking a step toward me. He had those old timber clients, the wealthy ones up north. You must have their numbers in his old ledger books. Can't you call them, Ellie? Ask for a short-term signature loan. Just $15,000. I'll pay them back double in 6 months. Please, Ellie, do this for the family. Do this for Julian's future." The psychological insight was almost laughable. Even in his absolute ruin, he was still trying to exploit me. He was invoking the family and Julian's future, using my motherhood as a lever to extract a favor, while completely ignoring the fact that he had spent 24 years treating my father's memory like a joke. He had never once visited my father's grave. He had refused to attend his memorial because it clashed with Richard's annual charity golf tournament. "My father's clients are retired, Marcus," I said, my voice dead and calm. "And they do not do business with desperate men." He blinked, shocked by the utter lack of warmth or pity in my response. His face hardened, the tears drying instantly as his default anger resurfaced. "You're cold, Eleanor. You've always been so cold. I've spent my life providing for you, and when my family needs you most, you just stand there." "I am standing here," I said, picking up my empty laundry basket. "And I am watching." On Wednesday morning, I met Arthur Sterling at a quiet, unassuming diner on the edge of town. "The foreclosure petition is finalized, Eleanor," Arthur said, sliding a copy of the legal complaint across the table. "We file it with the county clerk on Friday at exactly 4:31, 1 minute after the grace period expires. By Tuesday, Beatrice will be served with the formal eviction notice. Have they made any progress on the funds? I asked. None, Arthur replied. Marcus tried to liquidate his retirement account, but the penalties and the frozen business line blocked the transfer. He is trapped. And there is another development. The local newspaper has pulled the public filings. They are preparing a feature story on the financial collapse of the Vance estate for the Sunday edition. I took a slow sip of my tea. Let them print it. The town should know who they've been curtsying to. That evening, Clarissa and Richard came to our house. The atmosphere was poisonous. Richard sat in Marcus's armchair, pouring himself a generous measure of Marcus's scotch without asking. The only realistic option left is to sell the land to Henderson's development group, Richard said, his tone brutal and flat. They'll tear the Colonial down and build 3-story townhouses. It'll clear the bank debt and leave Beatrice with enough cash to buy a small 1-bedroom condo in the valley. Clarissa let out a sharp, hysterical shriek. Tear it down? Richard, that house has been in our family for 90 years. We cannot let some cheap developer erase our name. What will people say? Your name is currently worth garbage, Clarissa, Richard snapped, slamming his glass onto the wooden side table, leaving a wet, white ring on the varnish. We have no money. Do you want to pay the $14,000? Because I'm certainly not doing it. Marcus sat at the dining table, his face buried in his hands, silent. I entered the living room quietly, carrying a tray with a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of shortbread cookies. As I set the tray down on the coffee table, Clarissa spun on me, her face contorted with rage. Not now, Eleanor, she screamed, her voice cracking with a manic, desperate energy. We are trying to save our family's life, and you're bringing us cookies? Can you just leave us alone for once? Go do some laundry or something. You're completely useless right now. The room went dead silent. Marcus didn't defend me. Richard stared at his glass. I slowly straightened my back. I looked at Clarissa, at her stained silk blouse, her trembling hands, her desperate, ugly panic. Of course, I said, my voice incredibly soft. I'll be in the other room. I walked down the hallway to the dining room, where Marcus had left his laptop open alongside his legal files. He had been on the phone with his lawyer, Mr. Geller, trying to trace the ownership of EV Holdings. Suddenly, the landline phone on the wall rang. Marcus answered it in the living room, his voice frantic. Geller, did you find anything? I stood by the dining room window, looking out at the dark garden, listening to his voice through the open doorway. What do you mean you found the trust registration address? Marcus's voice rose, a sudden frantic note of hope vibrating in his chest. Where is the parent trust registered? Who is the trustee? A long pause. I heard the sound of a pen scratching against a yellow legal pad. Repeat that address, Geller, Marcus whispered. Another pause. The scratching of the pen stopped. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had ever filled our house. It was heavy, cold, and absolute. I didn't move. I stood by the window, my back to the door. No, I heard Marcus whisper. That's impossible. That's a mistake. He walked slowly into the dining room. I could hear his heavy, dragging footsteps against the hardwood floor. He stopped 3 feet behind me. In his hand, he held the yellow legal pad. Written on the paper in his messy, jagged handwriting was a single address, 124 Elm Street, Oak Harbor. The address of my father's small, damp house, the house where I had been raised, the house Marcus had refused to visit for 24 years because he said it smelled like cheap cabbage and failure. Eleanor, Marcus whispered, the yellow pad trembling in his hand, his voice shaking so violently he could barely form the syllables. What is this? Why is the banknote registered to your father's house? I slowly turned around. I looked at him, and for the first time in 24 years, I let him see the cold, absolute truth in my eyes. The silence in the dining room was not a sudden quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb that had been sealed for decades. Marcus stood frozen, his eyes darting from the yellow legal pad to my face, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked like a man who had suddenly stepped off a cliff in the dark and was waiting to hit the ground. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance, leaving only a raw, childish terror. "What did you do? How do you have this address?" I did not raise my voice. I did not smile. I simply stood by the window, my hands folded calmly in front of me. "I didn't do anything, Marcus," I said softly. "I merely inherited what was already mine." Clarissa and Richard, hearing the strange, strangled tone in Marcus's voice, walked into the dining room. Clarissa was clutching her glass of wine, her eyes narrowed in irritation. "What is going on in here?" she demanded, looking between us. "Marcus, why do you look like you're going to faint? Who is Geller? What did he say?" Marcus didn't look at his sister. He couldn't. He kept his eyes locked on me, his hand shaking so violently the yellow paper fluttered. "Tell them, Eleanor," he choked out. "Tell them who owns EV Holdings." Clarissa let out a sharp, scoffing laugh. "What does she have to do with the holding company? Eleanor doesn't even know how to read a corporate prospectus." "EV Holdings stands for Eleanor Vance," I said, my voice cutting through her laughter like a blade through silk. "I am the sole managing member of the trust. I bought the bank mortgage on Beatrice's house last week." Clarissa's glass of wine slipped from her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, the dark red liquid splattering across the rug and the white baseboards like a fresh wound. She didn't even look down. "You?" she whispered, her face turning a sickly mottled white. "That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. Your father was a nobody, a simple, small-town accountant who lived in a damp little house." "My father was indeed an accountant, Clarissa," I said, walking to the dining table. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out the old silver sugar tong I had saved from the boxes, setting it quietly on the polished wood. "But he was not a nobody. He was your father's primary investor." I reached into my purse and pulled out a faded, blue leather-bound ledger from 1974, placing it beside the silver tong. 50 years ago, when your father wanted to start Vance Construction, he didn't have the capital," I continued, looking directly into Clarissa's wide, horrified eyes. "He was a salesman with a grand idea and empty pockets. My father provided 80% of the seed money. In exchange, he took a quiet, non-voting 70% equity share in the parent trust. Your father was merely the public face of the company, Clarissa. He was an employee who wore a very expensive suit." Richard stood in the doorway, his face completely drained of color. As a businessman, he understood the legal reality of what I was saying instantly. "The partnership agreement," he muttered, his voice hollow. "If the primary shareholder didn't authorize the collateral." "Exactly, Richard," I said, turning to him with a polite, respectful nod. Under the terms of the original 1974 partnership agreement, any attempt to use family assets as collateral for private loans without the majority shareholder's written consent constitutes material breach. Marcus used Beatrice's house to secure his bridge loans 5 years ago. He forged the corporate authorization. Marcus fell back into a dining chair, his face buried in his hands, his chest heaving with silent, desperate dry heaves. "I filed the dissolution papers with the state court this afternoon," I said quietly. "The partnership of Vance Construction is legally dissolved. The brand name, the remaining equipment, the frozen business accounts, and this house. They do not belong to the bank. And they do not belong to you. They belong to my father's estate. They belong to me." The front door opened and Julian walked into the entryway holding his briefcase. He stopped, sensing the absolute freezing horror in the air. He looked at his father weeping in the chair, at Clarissa staring blankly at the red wine on the floor, and then at me. "Mom?" Julian asked, his voice suddenly sounding very young, very vulnerable. "What's going on? Why is everyone crying?" I looked at my son. I saw the 28 years of sacrifices I had made for him, the silent nights I had spent cleaning his grass stains, cooking his meals, and shielding him from the coldness of this family, only to watch him adopt their cruel, dismissive arrogance. "Julian," I said softly, walking over to him and gently smoothing the collar of his suit jacket. "You told me on Monday that I was useless. You told me that I couldn't help you with the family's real-world problems." Julian swallowed hard, his eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror. "Mom, I didn't mean it like that. I was just stressed." "The senior partners at your law firm, Julian," I whispered, patting his cheek gently. "Their largest corporate client is EV Holdings. I fund the trust that pays your salary. I suggest you go polish your brown leather loafers tonight. You're going to need them when you start looking for a new job on Monday." He stumbled back, his briefcase slipping from his hand and hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud. The room was completely silent now, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. No one screamed, no one begged. The weight of their own decades-long arrogance had finally collapsed upon them, and they were too buried to even fight back. I walked to the coat rack and retrieved my simple wool coat. I put it on, buttoning it slowly. I picked up my purse and my father's old blue ledger. I looked back at the dining room. Clarissa was on her knees, staring blankly at the wet red stain on the floor. Marcus was slumped in his chair, completely broken. Julian stood in the entryway, frozen in his own shock. They did not scream, because they finally understood the depth of the structure they had built on my back. And now that I had walked away, the entire ceiling was falling. I opened the front door. The cool, crisp night air rushed in, smelling of autumn rain and fallen leaves. I reached into my pocket and felt the heavy, ticking warmth of my father's silver pocket watch. It was 5 o'clock. The deadline had passed. I stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door wide open behind me, and walked down the steps into the quiet, beautiful dark.